Hi, everybody. Just chiming in with a very quick and exciting PSA. Our team at Courier is very proud to be the media partner for State of the Swamp with our friends at defiance.org. This is going to be a really exciting, informative event and rebuttal to President Trump's State of the Union. You can stream the whole event with elected officials, celebrities, activists who are literally walking the talk on what it means to be gloves off in this opposition movement against this president and administration. If you go to defiance.org, you can sign up if you want to be with us in person in DC for the event next Tuesday. Go to defiance.org. You can also use a special code Courier15 to get discounted tickets. But if you can't make it in DC, please join us on the live stream at youtube.com/CourierHQ, or just put into your search engine Courier Newsroom YouTube so you can watch the full event. We hope to see you there. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Gloves Off. I'm your host, Tara McGowan. I'm also the founder and publisher of Courier, a network of independent newsrooms across this country. This show, if you are new to it, is really about power, how it is built, how it is used and abused, and what leadership in this moment really looks like. We are living through unprecedented times. We are living through an administration unlike any other that is defying the Constitution and the rule of law at every turn, that is responsible for the execution of American citizens who are solely practicing their constitutional rights and freedoms. It really is a very dark and scary time for this country and for the world. And for this week's episode, I wanted to talk to someone who could provide a little bit of context for what we're all experiencing and how we got here. And that person is my friend Miles Taylor. You may have heard of Miles or heard Miles' story before. Miles was the whistleblower who was working as a senior advisor in the Department of Homeland Security during Trump's first administration. He penned an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times calling out the administration. And as you'll hear in this episode, he really did it to provide a voice for the many, many folks who worked in the first administration and were absolutely shocked about the defiance of the Constitution and the egregious ideas and plans being set forward, not only by Trump, but by Stephen Miller, someone who I hardly knew existed in the first administration, but who has become much better known as the architect of this second Trump administration's horrific and cruel immigration policies under DHS and ICE. I talked to Miles about his journey as a whistleblower. He is somebody who has experienced the repercussions of speaking out personally, professionally, reputationally, and it has only made him more emboldened, empowered, and frankly, braver to keep taking on this president and this administration. His story is really inspiring, but also he has a very unique perspective with the experience he has to be able to shed light on what's happening right now in this administration and how we can all defy this administration effectively, fight back, and truly ensure that the midterm elections later this year are too big to rig. That is how we're going to get out of this mess. Miles has brilliant ideas. He has really been at the forefront of this fight. His courage and the way he has put himself out on the line is truly inspiring. And I hope this conversation inspires you all as much as it inspired me. It is also chock full of context, history, and ideas for how we all can practice acts of defiance in our daily life that will add up. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation. Please share it, and please hit that subscribe button on YouTube. This is Gloves Off. I am really excited to be joined this week with my friend, Miles Taylor, who you may know as one of the most publicly outspoken opponents of Trump, who was actually worked within Trump's first administration as a special advisor and chief of staff in the Department of Homeland Security. He was the infamous whistleblower who put an opinion, an op-ed out in the New York Times in 2018 anonymously, and then made his identity known a few years later, and since has been fighting gloves off against Trump and now the second administration as well, for the past number of years. Miles, thanks so much for joining Gloves Off.
Gloveless, I'm here.
So happy to have you here and really excited to bring your story to our listeners. I know you've told it a million times, but I do want to start with bringing you back to that decision point you made when you were working within the administration to speak out anonymously at first. But really, what went through your mind? I mean, I think right now, just to set this up a little bit, whistleblowers are extremely important. And yet I want to really kind of get into the nuance of that when an administration is shamelessly, transparently covering up insane corruption and violence and incidents and things of this nature. Are whistleblowers even relevant anymore? I do want to talk about that. But we were living in a very different world and a different political system when you were in the first administration than we are today. So I kind of want to go back to then bring us to where we are here and how much has changed. So tell us a little bit about that experience for you being in the administration and what made you decide to actually pen that op-ed.
Yeah, we were in, as you noted, different world then. The reason I decided to blow the whistle from in the administration is it was obvious to me the world we could end up in. Imagine standing on a dam and seeing that the concrete is cracking. And you look left and you know that water going to the right is going to destroy homes and livelihoods and cities and be catastrophic. And the types of requests we were getting at the Department of Homeland Security daily, not monthly, not weekly, daily from the president were the types of things that you would characterize as cracks in the dam. And you'd say, you know, if he keeps doing that and if he's allowed to do that, the destruction could be extraordinary. And I'll give you just a couple of examples to bring you into my mindset at the time. I went into the Trump administration knowing full well who this guy was, not personally, but we'd all seen him. You didn't need to know Donald Trump to know who he was. You watched The Real Man on TV during the campaign. And so I had no interest in going into the first Trump administration. I was a lifelong Republican. I wanted to stay on Capitol Hill in the Republican majority and not go in, which was disappointing because any Republican or Democrat in Washington knows when your guy or gal gets elected and there's an opportunity to go work for them, that's the career apex, right? When someone calls and says, you know, do you want to be Deputy Homeland Security Advisor at the White House? That would have been a dream phone call for me to get until I got it from the Trump transition team. And I thought, no, I don't want to be at the White House with that man. So I stayed on Capitol Hill. Then a mentor of mine, someone I'd looked up to, John Kelly, 4-star Marine general, very nonpartisan guy, was picked to be Secretary of Homeland Security. And I started talking to them and his team at DHS about the problems they were confronting. Problems, namely, that the president already from day one was asking them to do illegal things. And they needed more people who understood DHS, who understood the law, who understood the oversight of the department to come in and help steady the ship and also advise the president to keep him from committing impeachable offenses. And Kelly gave me the worst sales pitch I've ever had for a job in my life. He said, Miles, it's not as bad as it looks inside the administration. It is so much worse. And I remember saying, and that's how you're going to get me to come join? But I understood what he meant. And I understood why he needed people in that circumstance. So fast forward, in year one of the administration, there were a lot of bad ideas that I will say we put back in the box. A lot of things. They are the things you are seeing now. If you think what the Trump administration is doing now is horrific, well, he wanted to do these things 8 years ago. And in year one, we were largely successful behind the scenes in preventing those things. It didn't feel like success. I don't think Americans felt like it was a pleasure cruise the first year of the first Trump administration, but it wasn't this.
No,
By the
but we
second year,
weren't aware of everything that was being prevented by folks inside. I think that's really important.
Yeah. And by the second year, I will just say that it was evident to me that we were less and less successful. He was systematically identifying and getting rid of people with a conscience. And that really reached its crescendo for me with the family separation policy, something that was the slowest moving train wreck I've ever seen. From Trump's first month in office, he wanted something like that to be implemented. He wanted children literally ripped from their parents at the border by design, just punitively, to say, don't come to America, we'll take your kids. Now, that's not exactly
fear mongering, right? Like for the
fear
actual optics of the actual cruelty that they were.
Yes. And I'll never forget John Kelly coming in to a morning staff meeting with a handful of us and slamming his fist on the table and saying, do not take any phone calls from the White House about this, because the White House, Stephen Miller and others, were pushing this policy. And Kelly said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. And then Kelly, ambiguously in a television interview, people forget that summer, he was asked about this because the story leaked out. And he said, we're not going to telegraph what we are and aren't going to do. Behind the scenes, though, he was saying, there's no way we're going to touch this. Anyway, fast forward second year, this comes to fruition. It gets ran through by the White House. So I'm inside this administration and I'm seeing it's no longer enough to say no to this guy. It's no longer enough to email the White House and say, this is illegal. Our lawyers say this is illegal, because they're doing it anyway. In those circumstances, what do you do? Do you keep your head down and execute illegal policies? No. Do you resign quietly? Maybe. Or do you decide, well, it's not really up to me, an unelected bureaucrat, to figure out whether to stop this one or that one? The people who fire and rehire a president of the United States are the American people. And I'll tell you, Tara, and then I'll pause. I grew very frustrated that a lot of people much more senior than me, much older than me, at the end of their careers, were not saying in public the things they were saying in private. I will tell you, the majority of the president's national security cabinet believed he was unfit for office or a danger to the fabric of our republic. Those are the words Jim Mattis expressed in private. A majority of them felt that way. And by year two, none of them were saying that publicly. And so I made the decision after one fateful night where we received a really unethical order from the White House to just go say the thing in a paper that everyone was saying privately in the administration, so people would know. And I chose the device of anonymity for a very particular reason, to get people's attention. I knew that if I quit that day and published it under my own name, people would pay attention for one day that the president's own team thought he was unfit for office, and then they would move on. I had to create some kind of spectacle to force people to read this and pay attention to what was happening. And I knew eventually that would have severe repercussions for me personally.
That's right. And it did, right? It ultimately did. So walk us through, though, that period of time after the whistleblowing op-ed that you penned was published, and when you actually decided to disclose your identity and why. Because I think that's one of the bravest and most surprising parts of the story, because it makes total sense to be anonymous to draw more attention and more curiosity and intrigue. But walk us through that period of time in between.
I'll tell you quickly what had happened. I was flying to Australia to go meet with some of our top intelligence partners about a very sensitive threat stream that we were monitoring. And one of my other mentors,
in your role at this point in time at DHS.
Yeah. Overseeing what we were doing on cybersecurity, intelligence, counterterrorism. And so I'm flying to the other end of the world. While I'm on the plane with the secretary, I get a phone call. Another mentor, John McCain, had passed away of brain cancer. And McCain, of course, was one of the very few people in the Republican Party at that time in the first Trump administration willing to stand up to the president when other people were capitulating. And it was just a sad moment for me. I was really sad that we had lost him. And then I get a phone call. It's about 3 a.m. in Australia. I'm asleep in a hotel, and my phones, my work phone and my personal phone, are doing pirouettes on the nightstand. It's like one's being called, the other's being called. It's like, who's trying to get a hold of me? And I answer, and it's the White House. And the president had been trying to get in touch with us because he wanted to direct us to raise all of the American flags across the country. Little did I know, and I found out that day, that it was our job at the Department of Homeland Security to tell all federal buildings across America when a head of state or a member of Congress died to lower their flags to half staff. And in fact, it was my job It had just been delegated down 10 steps in the bureaucracy because that decision didn't need to be made. If someone died and they were in office, you auto pen a signature and you tell the federal buildings lower the flags. Well, the president didn't like John McCain and he wanted to raise the flags back up. He was furious that they were honoring this fallen war hero. And I'll tell you, Tara, I mean, I don't blame people for saying that's the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't this or that. But the straw that breaks the camel's back is a straw, right? And it was that one moment. And I got up out of the hotel room bed and I went over to the desk and I just started writing. And I started writing what was initially a journal entry. I was journaling about everything I was experiencing. The fact that there was this immoral man in the White House who wanted to do such petty things like that to John McCain. And as I was writing it, my thought was, why the hell am I writing this to myself? What good does that do for me to complain to my future self or my kids about what I experienced? And with very little sleep, I messaged a contact over at the Times. I said, would you want to run this opinion piece? And this feeds into why I decided to come forward publicly eventually, Tara, because the reason I used that device to get attention isn't some novel thing I came up with myself. Probably one of my favorite books, I'm looking over at the bookshelf, see if it's right over there, is the Federalist Papers. It's the compendium of essays that our founding fathers wrote to sell the public on the Constitution. And they made this really weird decision when they published those. They decided not to attach their names. And these guys were famous. I mean, they were well-known people in American life. They were founding fathers at that point. They were being called that at that point, but they decided to publish these essays anonymously. Why? They weren't scared of retribution. What they were scared of is that people wouldn't pay attention to how important this was if they didn't remove their names from the equation and force people to focus on the message and not the messenger. So that's what they did. They wrote all those essays under a pseudonym, Publius. I actually have rarely talked about this in public, but I asked the Times in that moment, I said, could you publish this as Publius? Because I knew a discerning reader would understand, this guy's doing this for this purpose. But they said, we don't do pseudonyms, so we're just going to publish it as anonymous. Okay, that's what they did. But importantly, Tara, I felt like to tell people why Donald Trump was a danger to the country, I could not do it in an 800 or 900 word essay. I couldn't even do it in a book. I had to be able to cite specific episodes, incidents, things the president said, things that would identify me and sell me out. And so I made a commitment after that anonymous piece came out that I would come forward in my own name before the 2020 election. But I did that for two reasons. One, I did that to signal to people I will be out there talking about the details so you know who this man is before you go vote. Because most people aren't paying attention until the summer before an election, unfortunately. But a second reason was myself. Because I knew if I didn't lay down a marker for myself, I would be too scared to come forward. That when decision time came, and I knew that going and identifying myself would put me on the receiving end of his attacks, could result in threats to my life, could result in threats to my family, my livelihood, that I might look at that and say, maybe it's not worth it. Let's just stay anonymous. And I didn't want to make that decision. So I laid that marker down to force myself to live up to it. And I had hoped by the time the 2020 election rolled around that so many of these other cabinet members who had expressed these things in private would have come forward, and many of them haven't. And so I set off on a journey before I came forward to try to recruit people to come forward. And I will say, to a certain extent, it worked. We ended up being, as Jake Tapper called it in October of 2020, the largest group of ex-officials in American history to turn against a president who they served under. That worked then. But of course, people have short memories, and now he's back in office.
Yeah. And I want to dig into that a little bit too, because you were really clear-eyed and aware of all of the risks. And I think it's so brave and honorable, and you hope that that is really contagious to actually, identify yourself. You weren't found out. You made it public in hopes of creating more of a permission structure for others, which you absolutely did. You and others that came out and left the administration, spoke out against the administration, had been within and inside. That's so powerful. It's much more powerful than any Democrat or liberal who had been opposed to Trump and his agenda for a while speaking out. There's no question about that. But so many didn't follow your lead, and still to this day, now in a much, much, much worse version, right? And a version of this administration and this president that does not have folks like you fighting the good fight inside, right? He only has his allies in there. He's gotten rid of any dissent from within. I imagine, just based on how they're operating. We still have a lot of Republicans who say one thing behind closed doors about how they feel about this president administration, then a very another thing publicly and through their own votes and their obedience, essentially. And I'm just curious, as somebody who has experienced this personally, professionally, it has been your life for the past number of years. Talk to me about how you see, like, how are these folks living with themselves in this moment? Because it really is, it's about your conscience in a lot of ways, and morality and ethics and ethical codes. And so much of that has been just, I feel like, abandoned writ large by folks. Is it fear? Is it fear that is motivating them to still stay in line? And what does that fear actually look like? And did you experience that after the op-ed was published? Like, was there a witch hunt, a manhunt for you of
Yeah.
sorts? Like, what do you talk to me about what these folks are actually running scared from?
Yeah. Uh, I'll tell you what I thought it was. And then I realized it was something else. I thought these people were scared of ending up like I did. And I knew it was going to be bad. I was in another relationship at the time when I wrote the opinion piece, and that person, she was the only person, outside of the New York Times that knew I'd written it. And she had wondered aloud. We were sitting on a beach in Florida, and she said, "What's going to happen when you come forward?" And I said, "Worst case scenario?" She said, "Worst case scenario." I said, "A MAGA guy comes and pops me in the street, and that's it." And she said, "Okay, well, what's the second worst scenario?" The second worst scenario is we're forced to flee our home. We lose our jobs. Things between us get ruptured. We have to spend out our savings on security, and we're in a scary place for a while. Fast forward, that's what ended up happening is lost my home and job and personal security and life savings, and also ended up losing that relationship, and found myself on election day 2020 in a safe house in Northern Virginia under armed guard and with a pistol on the nightstand because of the death threats. That's how dissent looked like in the United States in October, November of 2020. And I think that image has now become a very familiar image because so many people now have been faced since that time period with threats to their lives and their livelihoods and their way of life for simply expressing a political opinion. So I knew it would get very bad. But it ended up being, at least that second worst scenario. They've taken twice. They've taken everything but my life from me. But I will say later, we can talk about this later, that's also very freeing. And once you've gone through that, there's really nothing anyone can deprive you of. They can't hold anything over you. They can't make you say one thing. I'll never go on a podcast or a television show or have a conversation with a person and feel compelled to say something I don't believe ever. Never again, ever. I get to be my full authentic self because I got to confront it in that crucible moment, which I say to people and potential whistleblowers is the most freeing thing that can ever happen to you. And it was freeing, but I did think I was wrong about one thing. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was wrong about one thing in particular, Tara, is I thought that fellow Republicans who remained silent were doing so because they saw what had happened to people like me or Olivia Troy or Elizabeth Newman or these people who came forward and spoke out and had their lives upended. And I was down in South Carolina with another person you and I both know well, Adam Kinzinger. And I was down there with Adam, and we were having a conversation about this exact same thing while he was still in Congress. And we've all had this discussion over barbecues and dinner parties. And I said, Adam, why is it that so many of our buddies that are in Congress that are Republicans are still saying this stuff to us in private, not in public? And he said, well, why do you think? I said, I think it's because they don't want, their lives threatened. They don't want their family members threatened. I had been doxxed mercilessly. Adam had already been doxxed a lot. His wife was standing next to us with their then newborn baby. And he said, I think you're wrong. I said, wrong. He said, I don't think that's what they're afraid of. I was like, how could they not be afraid of themselves and their loved ones being threatened with death? He said, I think they're scared of something bigger. I said, what is it? And he said, they're scared of getting kicked out of the tribe. And this was a really interesting statement. It's something that I had kind of been realizing. You and I both know Jonathan Haidt, the author, who's written about tribalism in our politics. But I didn't think tribalism would be more powerful than, like their lives and a threat to their family. And I thought about that after my and Adam's conversation. And it made me remember this old Jerry Seinfeld bit. Is Jerry Seinfeld used to open his shows with this joke. And he would say, surveys show Americans' 10 greatest fears, and their number one fear is public speaking. And this is true. And their number two fear is death. And so he would say to the audience, so your average American would rather be in the casket at the funeral than delivering the eulogy, which is a great joke and a very incisive commentary. But it also very aptly explains how these Republicans are operating. They see the tribe that they are in, that they have spent decades building their lives and careers in, as so important to everything, to their whole identity. They'd rather be dead than to be banished and to be exiled. But this isn't some novel thing. I mean, I don't want to get too philosophical, but like, Tara, we go back 2,000 years to antiquity. And what did the Roman Republic do? What was a greater punishment than death? You would exile a Roman. It was humiliating. The shame is what attached. That's what these people are afraid of. They're afraid of being kicked out of the tribe. And once you understand that, you can help make sure that that incentive structure is changed. You've done a lot of that in your career. I've been focused on that because if you know that's what people are most afraid of, then what you have to do is show them there's another tribe for them to go to. Right. They won't be out alone in the wilderness and they won't die. And there's lots of ways to do that. And I've explored lots of ways and some of them failed ways to try to figure out how do you create a tribe for the tribeless. But that is one of the key things. And on a small scale, that's what you would also call strength in numbers. When someone's trying to figure out whether to get their mom or their buddy to be on the same page as them about the chaos in our politics, well, you taking the first step and saying something shows them, oh, they won't be alone. You're out there. And the numbers grow and the numbers grow. And it's the same thing with these prominent figures in the Republican Party. One blows the whistle, it makes it easier for the next. And I will say, love or hate people like Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, that's why we are seeing this phenomenon crop up again, is a handful of those people in the MAGA movement have decided to take the risk. And it's made it a little bit easier for others in the movement to take the risk and on key votes defy this president.
I agree with that. What I struggle with is that it's, there's also a choice when you're in politics, especially if you've spent your entire career running for office, being an elected official, being a representative, whether you're representing your constituents or just your donors or your whatever, the folks that are going to get you paid better when you rotate out, you're still like, you understand consensus building is how to produce change, whether it's just amongst your friends and allies, it's bipartisan brokering, or it's getting public support. It's a mixture of those things. What's always been astonishing to me is why more folks that are definitely if they weren't in the first administration, are currently now Republicans holding the line for this administration, fiercely opposed to a lot of what this administration is doing, why they are not coming together and standing in unity against the administration and the president, which we all know, them included, would actually be more powerful than a growing opposition from the left, which, yes, is a big tent. So, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's just a failure of character in a lot of ways, right? There might not be a really good, elegant answer to this, but we all know, and it's been so frustrating to watch, that would make such a difference if even just 4 or 5 Republican senators banded together. John Thune organized them, and we're like, no, actually, this is where we're going to draw a line. And maybe he has done that, actually, to the point of all the work you did in the first administration that went unseen, where they have prevented some things. But it just feels like the line keeps moving, right? Where it's like, what is the line in which you will actually defy this president, Senator Thune, the majority leader in the Senate, right? Like, is it the execution of Americans for exercising their constitutional rights of free speech and protest, as we saw 2 people executed in Minneapolis? Is it everything that is in the Epstein files and the fact that this president is mentioned more than 1 million times? Like, we still haven't hit the line. It feels like there is no floor. And I'm curious, as somebody who has lived through this, and frankly, you are not, I mean, knock on all the wood imaginable, Miles, like, you're not in jail. You haven't been executed for treason, right? Actual threats from this administration. Like, I mean, he's still president. I'm quite worried about how they ramp up and accelerate violence against political dissent. I hope that you have more cover as someone who is actually more publicly out there, but we know that you're still a target. Is the fear still at play here? Or is it also that a lot of them still believe that this isn't so bad and there will be a way out to constitutional norms again? Does that exist?
Yeah. Well, I got to say, when you were saying that, it made me think about the guy who was my security guard for a while, Dennis. I would hop in the car in the morning, and we would go into DC and go into work, and I would say, "Morning, Dennis. How are you?" And every day he would say, "Well, I woke up and I wasn't dead." So it's a low bar, a low bar of success. But I feel that way now about Dennis. Woke up, I wasn't dead, and I wasn't in jail. But I will say that it's great that you point out implicitly here that there's not inevitability to it. In other words, there is a choice that these people have. And I'll sketch an example of it. Just before the midterm elections in 2018, I had just published this opinion piece. There were at least a half a dozen people in Trump's cabinet who I knew who would be ready to sign on to the invocation of the 25th Amendment if things got any worse. That's very serious. That's one of the things I wrote in the opinion piece, that it's so bad that cabinet members are talking about invoking the clause in the Constitution to remove the president if he loses it anymore, because he was so unhinged in that window and always. There was a convening outside of Washington, out in Virginia in the countryside, where there were some conversations about whether all of those cabinet members should band together, resign en masse, and come forward and disclose their concerns. You can imagine what side I argued in that conversation. Get your asses out there and do this. The American people need to hear from you. And I will tell you, in the weeks leading up to the midterms, this plan, this possibility of cabinet members resigning en masse to highlight the president's instability fell apart, because one by one, those cabinet members convinced themselves of all the reasons not to do it. Well, if we do this and the Democrats win in the midterms, Trump's going to be able just to blame us and distract from our message. Well, if we just stay a little bit longer, we might be able to prevent more bad things. A zillion justifications. And then it fell apart and it never happened. Fast forward to today. We, in the past month, have found out that roughly 50 members of Congress will be resigning this term.
That's right.
A lot of those are Republicans, and some of the most moderate Republicans. I don't know if a conversation like this has happened. I know in previous Congresses it has, where those resigning members who share a view, many of them, of the president's instability, have talked about whether to come forward publicly, call it out, or do something radical, like throw their support to the Democrats to change the balance of power in the House or the Senate, under the condition that they find a consensus speaker or House leader and place demands on the president. Those conversations have happened before, and they've fallen apart. Now, those 50 people that are resigning from Congress, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity that's quickly dwindling. But right now, some of those people could find their backbone and say, you know what? Just takes a handful of us to throw our support to the Dems. We don't have to become Democrats. We can say, you know what? We're going to govern as a bipartisan coalition until this administration ceases its abuses of power and restores respect for the U.S. Constitution. That's it. That's what they have to do, and they'll have extraordinary power. I suspect it's the fear taking hold of all of them that in doing that, they'll be kicked out of the tribe. They won't find cushy jobs in Washington afterwards. They can't become effective lobbyists, and they'll lose that identity as Republicans. And so they do what you just said, Tara. They self-justify and they say, it's bad now, but we're going to bounce back. We're going to bounce back, and it doesn't need me. And that sort of logic, just like courage is contagious, complicity is more contagious than COVID-19. Complicity and the self-justifying flies through the Republican caucus. And all these folks are saying the same thing. Yeah, he's a psycho, but, he'll be gone in a couple of years. Forgetting the fact that last time he had the opportunity to transfer power peacefully, he did not. So that's what I think is going on in their minds. But their minds are changeable, because you can convince people. I would have never in my wildest dreams imagined a Marjorie Taylor Greene would join the Defiance in this country, right? Or a Thomas Massie. They would have been at the bottom of my list. But the calculus for some of these folks can change. And I still think there is a possibility of getting more of those significant figures to hold this administration accountable.
Right. And sometimes it comes from a very principled place, which I actually believe is Massey, in terms of his adherence and commitment to the Epstein files and the promises made to his constituents, et cetera, on this. Marjorie, I don't know. I think ego's at play there. It plays in different ways with folks, but we'll take it wherever there can be kind of rifts. You actually wrote in your 2018 op-ed, quote, "It may be cold comfort in this chaotic era, but Americans should know that there are adults in the room." Obviously, that was in 2018 in the first administration. Fast forward to now, we had 4 years of Biden. You and I worked together along with many other unlikely allies and friends to get Trump out of office in 2020. And then, of course, now we are back here. And there are very clearly no longer any adults in the room, right? What you said would be cold comfort then. We do not have that comfort now. I have to ask you about Stephen Miller. So Stephen Miller was around in the first administration, correct? You worked with Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller
very closely.
Yes. He is much more of a known name and figure in America today than he certainly was. I don't know that I knew who Stephen Miller was in the first administration. And I think that he is credited pretty largely for DHS's current strategy they are executing in terms of immigration control and ICE. And there are not folks that are providing the checks and balances that people like you were in the first administration. As somebody who had, a front row seat to what they wanted to do and the leveraging of cruelty and violence to evoke fear and submission and self-deportation, did you see all of this coming? Like, is it playing out exactly as you feared that it would? Is it worse? What can we expect moving forward?
Well, I'll characterize it. So I wrote this book in 2023 called Blowback, and I went on a mission for about a year to go interview as many of my former colleagues in the Trump administration, the first administration, as I could, from the Department of Education to the Defense Department to DHS to the literal staff assistants that sat outside the Oval Office, to ask them all one question: what did Donald Trump want to do in a first term that he will do in a second term? My goal was just to paint the picture for people. Is they could have cynically dismissed the Axis of Adults thesis, which many did, and I don't blame them, as, come on, I don't need unelected bureaucrats like you guys to protect me from the president. Screw you, you know, up on your high horse protecting us. I get it. It is a very uncompelling thesis to put out there, is trust us, we're keeping the president from doing worse things. Well, what are those worse things? I get why people hated that concept. Now I think they see it and they understand why. And it's because those 100 people told me some of the most horrific stories that I've ever heard of things that I didn't know at the time Trump had wanted to do in the administration. And I realized for every one of, us at DHS that was stopping illegal things for Trump, there were 20 more at other departments and agencies having those same fights and debates. That book probably had, 200 or so sober-minded forecasts about what would happen in a second Trump administration. I just published an article the other week, and I said, I went back through, and 90% of those forecasts in that book, Blowback, have now come to fruition. Don't read any comfort into that it's like, well, the worst is already behind us, because a lot of those things were the administration putting in place the machinery for repression. That machinery will now function for many, many years. But they've done like I said, the very explicit answer to your question is 9 out of 10 things I predicted have come true. So it's almost as bad as I thought it would be. And I sketched out what I imagined would be the worst case scenario. We're very close to the worst case scenario. And Stephen Miller himself brought us right to the precipice of what I think was the worst case scenario. The past couple of weeks, it was more plausible than ever that the president of the United States would have declared the invocation of the Insurrection Act and deployed armed active duty U.S. troops on U.S. city streets to take over. It's the closest thing to martial law in the American system of government. Keep in mind, this is the same Stephen Miller who fantasized about suspending habeas corpus in the United States. What is habeas corpus? Refresher for everyone. This is your right to challenge your detention. If government agents throw you in jail, habeas corpus, this constitutional norm says you have a right to petition a judge and say, I have been detained in jail. I don't think this is lawful. Stephen Miller talked openly last year about suspending that right. All right. Combine those two things, active duty military on U.S. city streets with the ability to pick people up for infractions as small as spitting chewing gum on a car and the inability to challenge your detention. That is gulag level stuff. That is third world country stuff. That is pure autocracy. We were on the cusp of it because Stephen Miller was out there building the case that the protesters, the peaceful protesters in Minnesota, were, in his words, insurrectionists and terrorists. Now, it seems that the president temporarily got cold feet, but this was a scenario I spelled out in blowback that I was very worried about, and not academically. I had personally been on the receiving end of the first instance I'm aware of Trump directing the invocation of the Insurrection Act. Before one of his State of the Union addresses in 2019, I had to rush to the White House because I was tipped off by staff that the president was going to surprise announce in his speech he was invoking the act and sending the military to the U.S. border to round up anyone. We were worried this not only would be illegal, but it would set the precedent for Donald Trump to be using American troops all over inside the U.S. homeland. We convinced the president not to do this. He was literally standing, practicing in front of the teleprompters in the map room of the White House, and he backed down. But I think this past month, we got even closer than that. And I can't tell you why Trump decided not to do it, but the fact that we got that close tells me that at any moment, we could be on the cusp of that happening. And that's because, more than anything, Stephen Miller is driving that agenda. He is the beating heart and the flaccid brain of Donald Trump's autocratic pursuits in this country. And I think that's something to be worried about for as long as he's in a position of power.
If there is no Stephen Miller, does this strategy fall apart or end? Like if he is driving it, because I'm very curious about this from a political and communication strategist perspective, right? Should we be focusing much more energy and attention on increasing visibility and awareness of Stephen Miller? He's a horrific human being. It's very hard to imagine anybody liking him. He's worse than JD Vance in terms of likability. And
yeah,
I mean, he just oozes, evil cartoon villain, and he is clearly the brainchild of this specific strategy of cruelty and violence, and doesn't seem to care about the optics the way that we know Trump does, right? Trump is a PR mastermind. He understands that he needs to be driving the narrative to not be on defense. I don't know that Miller cares because I don't know that he has any conscience or soul. It's very clear he doesn't. But would that be an effective strategy to try to increase visibility and frankly demonstrate that he is running the strategy and not Trump, because we know Trump doesn't like to be sidelined like that, to push him out? Or is the cake already baked? Like, that's one question I have related to Miller is like, could we actually effectively mobilize around having him pushed out for XYZ reasons? And would that make a difference, or is it beyond that?
It would actually make a difference. It would actually make a difference, and I'll tell you why. And recent reporting validates what I've been saying for years, which is that Stephen deeply micromanages the operations of the bureaucracy. I used to be on the receiving end of 6 to 8 phone calls from him a day of have ICE do this, have CBP do this. And we were constantly in a fight with the White House about these things that they wanted to do.
Which by all accounts is still happening, because Kristi Noem came out in a defensive posture when folks are calling for her impeachment, right, and resignation, saying, I literally took the orders word for word from Stephen Miller.
Yes.
I did what Stephen Miller told me to do.
That's exactly what's happening today, except this time, of course, people aren't saying no to him. There are a vast array of decisions, I think, that are being made by this administration that might be made a different way were he not there. That's not to say that Stephen Miller resigning from this administration somehow mollifies Trump and he becomes this moderated president. Don't get any illusions about that. But some of the more extreme things that have happened wouldn't have happened because there were countervailing forces in the administration that just weren't strong enough. And I'll give you an example. When the mass deportation crackdown started, you had people like Brooke Rollins, the Secretary of Agriculture, come to the president and appeal to him, stop this. Your allies who own major farms in the United States, major corporations, don't want to see this because these are their employees. And Trump, it sounds like, was persuaded by that for a beat. until Stephen Miller got back into the picture and said, no, this is what we were going to do. This is what we are going to do. And Trump ended up siding with Stephen Miller and against Brooke Rollins. Those are how those debates play out. And removing a Stephen Miller from the equation could very much change things. I'll tell you this. John Kelly said to me once, after he left as Trump's chief of staff, he had met on the battlefield in the U.S. military a lot of very, very evil people and, terrorists who want to do this country harm. And he expressed to me that Donald Trump was one of the most evil people he'd ever met in his entire life. And
which
are powerful
Jeffrey
words.
Epstein is also quoted as saying.
That's right. Epstein and John Kelly, both saying that. Two guys I never thought would be in the same sentence, and they are. Stephen is worse because Stephen's efforts are done wittingly. Donald Trump doesn't know why he does what he does. He does it for his own self-interest, but the man is not self-possessed. He has no capacity for self-reflection. He has no discernible worldview and conscience. He is acting emotively and reflexively, always in his own perceived self-interest. He has no cogent philosophy. Stephen, on the other hand, has a very, very considered, detailed, philosophical worldview, and one that just happens to be so deeply rooted in nihilism and depravity. But he is therefore more strategic. He knows what his ends are, and he thinks daily about the means to achieve those ends in a way that Donald Trump does not. That is what makes Stephen Miller vastly more dangerous than the president himself, as a person who could do damage to this country.
That's exactly right. And we're watching this play out. And he also clearly knows how to connect the dots and sell to President Trump that his vision, his philosophy, his strategy will also achieve what Trump wants for himself. Right. Even though those outcomes or those, variables are different. And so I'm just fascinated by that because I really feel like we should all be spending a lot more attention and focus on Stephen Miller because we also know Trump's ego. He doesn't like to be outshined in any way. And this is not his strategy. But so going back.
It worked with Elon. I will just say it worked with Elon. And also he's got a really good target in Stephen for this. I received a phone call one time. This was, I think, the spring of 2019 from Stephen Miller after Trump said, I want you to take over immigration policy because he was so frustrated that we were saying no. And Stephen called and told me, he said, today was my coronation day. Those were his words. Today was my coronation day. Stephen perceived himself a king in Trump's universe. Trump knowing things like that really, really gets to him. When he heard things like that about Elon Musk, eventually he soured on the guy. I think you're onto something, Tara.
That's right. And by the way, when he soured on the guy who's responsible for the attention refocused on the Epstein files? Musk. Folks forget that. Elon Musk, when he got pushed out of the
started with a tweet
and left with Doge, tweeted. So we should really, look into those Epstein files again. So, I mean, this is important because Trump is impressionable. And we also know that the thing that impresses him the most is wealth. It's money. It's money talks, right? We have a pay-to-play administration right now. And that's the only way I think he and Musk have preserved any relationship is Musk has an enormous amount of money. Miller doesn't have that. I feel like he'd be an easier one to take a fall if we just focused our energy. So anyway, going back to the much scary reality that we're living in right now, which also you predicted would happen and we see could happen any moment right now, is the declaration of martial law, right, through the Insurrection Act. And what we know is their outcome, which is being able to actually have a military presence against the American people in order to impose order and compliance and obedience on the American people, stripping us of all of our constitutional rights. We've already seen this start to play out. They're pushing the envelope here. And the connection to this to the elections, because why would they continue to enact an agenda that is so deeply unpopular unless they were not fearful of being taken out of their positions of power? So in terms of everything that you've seen, experienced, witnessed, observed up close, and just your own ability to forecast, knowing the characters at play here and the circumstances at play, what is their move when it comes to the elections this year and in 2028? Like, do you believe that they think there is a path to them staying in power? Because all signs point to, if there are free and fair elections, it's going to be a tsunami of opposition to this administration and to the Republican Party.
Well, I'll say this. It's not that they might meddle in the elections. They're already meddling in the elections.
That's right.
And I would say, to put a fine point on it, a crime is in progress right now. Actual criminal activity is in progress. It is not lawful or constitutional for a president and his administration to interfere in the administration of elections for partisan purposes. Not lawful. And I already think we have evidence that they have engaged in illegal activity in the state of Georgia. The FBI raid in Georgia that the administration says had to do with voting irregularities. The president, as he always does, cut out the legs from underneath those investigators in an interview 2 weeks ago in the Oval Office with NBC when he said, well, who knows why those agents went in, but I'll tell you what, they're going to find out who won in 2020, and they should. They said it was foreign interference. That's what they were investigating. They said it was claims of irregularities in 2020. Donald Trump said the quiet part out loud. I sent in federal agents to recount the ballots. That is illegal. That is unconstitutional. A federally mandated unilateral recount by the president of the United States violates state law. It violates the U.S. Constitution. This will be investigated. Mark my words. This whole episode will be investigated in the future. Right now, we don't have an FBI willing to do it. It will be investigated. And it shows us that a crime is in progress. And I think that one episode displays one of the tactics that they're very likely to use in November is finding districts that are competitive swing districts and claiming fraud and sending in federal agents to seize the ballots. At that point, after the chain of custody is broken and it goes into Trump's hands, people they know will lose confidence in the outcome of those elections. They can use that uncertainty to get the House to refuse to seat those members of Congress in those districts who won. The way that we counter it is exactly what you said, Tara. We have to make the midterm elections too big to rig. They are going to try to rig them. They are actively trying to meddle in these elections. If the outcome, though, if the turnout is so overwhelming that even a pollster who's doing exit polls shows that those exit polls off the charts find a win in a district that Trump says is on the bubble, that will be enough for the American people to really rise up in the way that they need to hold this government accountable. It could get very bad. I do think that there's a very likely situation where these elections are contested by the White House. They try to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. But if the election is too big to rig, then the American people will see through that instantly. They will take to the streets. They will be infuriated. That pressure, I would hope, would be insurmountable for this administration. I don't want us to end up in that position, but it starts with us making sure it's the biggest turnout in American history.
That's exactly right. And I know we are close to time. I have to ask you as this last question, after everything you have been through and put yourself out there, Miles, you are still out there. You recently started another organization called Defiance to be able to build and strengthen opposition to this administration in a number of different ways. Tell us what Defiance is, how folks can get involved, and what right now is giving you courage to keep going after everything that you've already done and have been through?
Yeah, it is very simply that word. In April of last year, I knew that Trump would come back into office and try to get revenge against me in some way, shape, or form. I was clear-eyed about that. I expected he would revoke my security clearance, which he did, something along those lines. What I didn't expect is that he would do what he did last April, which is on April 9th, he ordered, for the first time in American history, no president has ever ordered a federal investigation by executive order into an individual critic for First Amendment protected speech. He did. He signed his name on the order. He said, in his view, I was guilty of treason, and effectively put the verdict before any investigation.
Yes.
So I'm guilty of treason, ordered that.
For listeners to hear that, Miles is that individual that the Trump.
That's correct. And I will say, we had retreated, Tara, me and my wife and our family, from public life. We had a young baby. We moved out of Washington. We're growing a family. And we had started a small business, 50 or so employees, staff, and contractors. That declaration by the president destroyed our business, cost us close friends. We had a number of threat actors come out of the woodwork to threaten not just me and my wife, but our young daughter. Our lives imploded again. It was a very hard year. It was this word that literally turned it around. This may sound trite to people, but in a conversation with my wife, we talked about how we had gone from this navel-gazing sort of self-pity moment of sad that our lives had just blown up again from this guy. And when we decided to shift from being defensive and hiring lawyers and all of that into a defiant posture, we decided to request inspector generals open an investigation. We decided to prepare a lawsuit. We decided to do all of these affirmative things, completely changed our mindset, changed our psychology in this household. We were energized. Just that shift from defensiveness to defiance. And my wife and I were in a conversation about, okay, well, if that worked for us to not be in such a self-pitying posture, how do we help other people? Because I tell you what, 2025 felt like a year of self-pity. We were all sad Donald Trump was back. The country was like, there's nothing we can do. Everyone was sad. And we were in those conversations, and someone that I don't know terribly well, but I had a podcast conversation with Marianne Williamson. I told her about this, and she said, why don't you just go buy the web address right now and launch the organization this month? That's literally what she said. And people like you and me, we focus group things, we test them, we talk to people for 6 or 8 months, we try to figure out what's the right thing to do. She said, Miles, that's silly. You should just go do it. And so I literally did. I went and bought the web address, didn't even know what the organization would do, and said, we should just go launch a club of people willing to defy this administration. Now, defiance.org has grown to more than 10,000 members and 100,000 supporters. Every single week, we take our member fees, we pool them together, and we go fund actions to counter Trump's abuses of power. Real stuff, because I'm sick of just doom scrolling. I want every week to do a thing to fight back. So that's what we've done. And the thing that we're doing next week is on Tuesday, February 24th, we are co-hosting with Courier, I'm thrilled to say, a rebuttal to the State of the Union. This will be the biggest rebuttal event to the State of the Union, with people across the ideological spectrum coming out and talking about the truth of what's happening in our country and Donald Trump's abuses of power, and most importantly, what can be done about it, what we can do to reaffirm commitment to the Constitution and to restore our republic. So I'm incredibly excited about that. And if folks are interested in joining in person, they can. There's a handful of in-person tickets left. They can go to defiance.org/SOTU, SOTU. But there's also virtual tickets, and they can watch the free live stream through Courier. So I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with you all for this. And I actually genuinely don't think we've ever seen a rebuttal event like this to a State of the Union, not of this scope and magnitude. So we're thrilled to collaborate with you all on that.
We're excited about the event, excited to be partnering with you, and just even more so excited about Defiance and everything you just mentioned. We all need to be speaking out. We all need to be taking actions every day to defy this administration and regime. And you leading always, Miles, your courage is contagious. And I hope that more folks join this movement to see what's possible. There are more of us, and we can make these elections too big to rig, and we can change the next stage of history. So you give me a lot of hope. Thank you for demonstrating your gloves off leadership and courage, Miles. And we'll see you at the SOTU event. These conversations and the courage of these leaders are only as contagious as the audiences we reach. So if you felt inspired by this conversation and episode, please consider sharing it on your own social platforms and with your friends and networks. If you don't already, please follow Courier Newsroom wherever you follow news and information, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and hit that subscribe button on YouTube so you can be the first to know when our next conversation drops. So excited to be in this fight with all of you. And until next time, please take care of yourselves. We need you.